Welcome to Insight, produced in partnership with WDSC, WRPT in Duluth, Minnesota. Today we are chatting with Tina Olson, Executive Director of Mending the Sacred Hoop, who has generously agreed to share some of her experience with us. I'd like to thank you, Tina, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So, Mending the Sacred Hoop. First, from the perspective of somebody who is largely ignorant of Native culture, what is the sacred hoop?
Well, it comes from a prophecy from a man named Black Elk. Our history is very complex and based on the colonization, the genocide, and the assimilation of tribes in this country. Black Elk made a prophecy that'll take 7 generations to erase all the violence, the dysfunction, the genocide. And in that 7 generation, children will be born that will be able to address and correct the wrongs that were done to them. So we took that prophecy and we named it into our organization because our organization works on a lot of issues that are important and impactful to tribes and tribal people across the country.
So the sacred hoop is an image of renewal.
Yes.
But renewal takes time. Renewal takes effort. Renewal takes attention. Talk about how you are converting time into impact that is healing.
Well, our primary work is educating both Native and non-Native communities on a national level, a local level, and even on a global level. We have the highest rates of domestic violence, the highest rates of sexual assault, the highest rates of youth suicide, the highest rates of murder, poverty, unemployment, alcoholism, diabetes, and we weren't born this way. So it's a long history of understanding trauma, relocation, genocide, to really educate communities on where we are today. We are funded by the Department of Justice, Office of Against Violence Against Women, to go into tribal communities who are funded by the Department of Justice and help them to develop a response, whether it be a law enforcement response or build a better women's shelter or organize a tribal court. The challenge is there are 573 federally recognized tribes in this country, all with varying resources and land bases and the lack of infrastructure. So the challenge is pretty heavy. In Alaska, there are over 200. They're not called tribes, they're called villages, Native villages, and they are they're not considered Indian country. So in as much as they're not, the legislation that comes through the feds with the Violence Against Women Act and Title IX that was passed affect them differently. Like, there's an example. They have over 200 villages and they've been living there since a millennium. They have less than half of their villages, maybe a third of their villages, have tribal village safety police officers that carry no guns. They have old sheds or mobile homes that act as places to incarcerate them and hold them till the Alaska State Patrol comes along. And yet they have the highest rates of violence in those villages, highest rates of alcoholism that gets brought in, highest rates of suicide.
And finally, these issues are being covered. You're beginning to see exactly this issue in Alaska being covered by the media, but through years of neglect, and also a reluctance at a certain point. There has been a bit of a pause in the violence and in the neglect and in the sometimes paternalistic efforts to provide help that was misinformed. And I think now we're getting to the point where just through dialogue, there is information, valuable information being exchanged so that people who are largely ignorant on certain aspects of the challenge that is being confronted, people like myself, can finally be informed by people like yourself.
Yeah, most of our work is educating non-Native communities and governments. You know, there's this myth about who we are as a people. Well, let's just take Duluth, for example. In the response for law enforcement, respond to domestic violence and sexual assault case, a lot of our people suffer from addiction. A lot of them are homeless. And when when a woman, like a homeless woman who may been drinking, reports a sexual assault, they'll take her to detox, not always take her to a medical facility, because they look at the alcohol first.
Right.
And the addiction, and not what led her to that addiction. What kind of trauma is buried deep below layer upon layer that where she chooses to drink because she's blocking all that stuff out. And it's always a fight against public perception of who we are as people. I've got 4 grown daughters. You don't hear a whole lot about, we're in the helping fields. I've got an attorney for a daughter, a school teacher for a daughter, a nurse for a daughter, and a social worker for a daughter. But you don't see that. We're not portrayed as much out there in the public as being professional, as being articulate, educated. I mean, that's one of our challenges. It's also one of our barriers, public perception of who we are. You know, we're not just homeless. We're homeless for a reason. We're not going to be able to address a lot of these issues that are going to help our community until we address the issues of poverty, unemployment, and addiction also.
Well, in many respects, what you're doing is you're recreating the culture that you need today. Any culture is creating and recreating itself all the time. But in the aftermath of such destruction, where there are still places of knowledge, and there's still elders who have memory, and even the people who have forgotten, the fact that they know that they've forgotten and in themselves create the will to recreate and learn, that is a life-affirming act. And what you're doing is you as a community are reestablishing this knowledge, and also you're creating the traditions of the future.
Well, I wouldn't say creating. I would say restoring.
Restoring
The traditions. And a part of restoring the traditions is some of our elders, especially, I mean, I've been in Alaska about 10 different times, and all over. I've been to every state in this country except maybe 4 on the East Coast and in Alaska. But giving permission for elders to remember their values is the hardest thing, because this country taught them to forget, made them forget, punished them if they spoke their language, punished them. In treaties that were created, they didn't want to deal with women, and our leaders said, where are your women? They wanted to deal with men only. But the thing that burns in my memory the most, and is real hard to accept and is sad, is that the history of this country promoted and said men were the leaders in your families. We make treaties with men. Families who had land also assimilated and copied that and took their land, and their sons inherited it, not the women who inherited it. They gave it to their sons. So the Bakken oil fields, I have a friend named Karen whose brother got all the land, and she got nothing from the land. Their father had willed it to the boys, not the girls. And they get a per capita payment from the oil that's being taken out of there on a monthly basis, and her brother does not know how to deal with that kind of money, and has been rolled, has been taken advantage of, drinks all the time. Meanwhile, Karen has to go bail out of jail and go visit her. That is a direct impact of what happened in history for women. That's a disrespect for women, and the fact that we are not promoting or keeping the values that women should be respected. They're life givers. But that happens today. It's not happening in the past.
Now, you also have a program, the Training and Technical Assistance to Tribal Governments program. Mm-hmm. Talk about that program. What is the content of that, and what do you hope to achieve?
As you know, the United States has a special relationship with tribes across the country, negotiated in treaties a long time ago. They're responsible for health, education, different things. When the Violence Against Women Act was passed, there was a small portion of funding that went to a tribal set-aside. There was like 12 tribes out of 573 who got funding to develop programming to combat domestic violence. Over the course of years and time, it's increased tremendously. But the funding goes to tribal governments because they're the entity, they're sovereign nations. And when they apply for funding and they get funded, there's certain things they promise to do. And so either train law enforcement, either create a tribal court that addresses domestic violence, whatever it is. What we do is we're funded by the Department of Justice, Office of Guidance Fund, to help tribal governments and their programs establish shelters or transitional housing or a tribal code that addresses sexual assault and domestic violence.
So you act as a kind of an information clearinghouse of how to, when they receive the funding. So now they have a bucket of cash, and they must use that cash in certain ways, and you help as an information clearinghouse to shape programs that would be appropriate to fulfill the requirements of the federal government that came with the grant.
Right.
So if you're speaking to two different groups, one is the diverse Native communities, and you're saying, my friends, we need to do this. And if you were to speak with non-Native communities, people like myself, and you were to say, my friends, we need to do this, what would you say to the first community, and what would you say to the second community?
To the first group, I wouldn't say what they need to do. I would first go into the community and find out what their traditions and their practices in their community are. Because we've had enough of people coming into a community and telling them what to do.
Well, the first thing you would say is respect yourself, learn and explore your own traditions.
Right.
And
I'd get to know what that community's tradition is, and then I'd bring in my knowledge that I have in combination with their traditions and point out a cause and effect. With the other group, I would ask them to immerse themselves, learn more about the diversity of tribal nations, and go and visit these nations and be true and transparent and honest with yourself. The U.S. Attorney of the United States about a year ago went to Alaska. They heard all of this stuff that was coming out of Alaska about the disparity of Alaska Native women not getting treated right. And they went to villages, and he was so appalled by it, the U.S. Attorney, he came back and they found money, millions of dollars, to create more tribal police, more law enforcement in those villages, because he went there and he saw it. It's the same thing I would ask somebody here. Go and visit the Oglala Nation or Rosebud or a Pueblo in South Dakota or the Wampanoags, go visit them.
Tina Olson, thank you so much for sharing the fantastic work of Mending the Sacred Hoop. Thank you so much for bringing to the eyes of someone who is partly blind to the lives and traditions and cultures of Native peoples here some new intelligence, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much.
Welcome to Insight, produced in partnership with WDSC, WRPT in Duluth, Minnesota. Today we are chatting with Kris Eilers, Executive Director of the St. Louis River Alliance. Kris has generously agreed to share some of her experience with us, and thank you, Kris, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So the river looms really large in American history. If you take a look at the rivers, they were our first highways, and even before that, they were sources of nourishment. They were sources of agricultural bounty. Talk about the river in this area of the country and why it is so important.
Being the second largest tributary to Lake Superior is, the largest tributary, U.S. tributary to Lake Superior is one of a huge importance for our whole area here. But Lake Superior has always gotten all of the glory and all of the praise, but we have to look at the rivers that feed the lake, because the lake is only as clean as the rivers are.
How this is all bound together is so important. The watersheds feed the rivers and the lake. The watersheds include agricultural areas. So you have runoff from agriculture. They include the suburban and urban areas, so they're runoffs from the cities, and all that ends up in the Great Lakes. All that ends up in our drinking water, all that ends up in the food that we eat, and either directly or indirectly it impacts our lives. So it's very important to consider what we are doing on a day-to-day basis and how that is going to come back and impact ourselves.
Correct. And when you look at the history of the river, it started off as pristine, as all rivers and all water has. Over time and development, the people really forgot about the river being a source of life, and so that's how some of the pollution happened back in the, as far back as the 1900s, and then especially during like the industrial boom in the 60s and 70s. Things started getting really bad in our estuary here because of industrialization, and what the industry was doing was not illegal at the time. It was just the thing to do, to dump waste and pollution into the waterways. And so the history is that some laws were changed because of the dire need of, like, people finally all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but people recognized that what we were doing to the rivers was not okay. There was so much pollution, and even rivers were catching on fire. And so the Clean Water Act was passed, and those were some of the major things that have happened in our estuary. Is after the Clean Water Act was passed, and later on WLSSD came online, and then that helped remove a ton of mercury out of the water.
WLSD, could you?
Western Lake Superior Sanitary District.
Okay.
Was instrumental, and also in Superior, the sanitary district in Superior was instrumental in removing mercury from the water. And all of these things sort of gelled together to create the means by which we were able to then start cleaning up the river. We had to stop it first, and then to start changing our practices. And so the St. Louis River Alliance has been a part of that process since after the Clean Water Act was passed, and they started the Area of Concern process, which actually went around the Great Lakes, and they designated 43 different areas around the Great Lakes because of the pollution that needed to be cleaned up. And so the St. Louis River Alliance was born out of that process with the EPA.
How do you create that dialogue of people who have different interests, who would like to continue in a way that other people think are harmful? How do you create that connection so that we don't end up with more heat than light in that process?
We're trying to help people reconnect to the river and to the water, because the reason why we can pollute something is because we've lost our connection. And when you don't understand, or you take it for granted, might be a better word, when you take it for granted, we always take things for granted until it's too late. A lot of times it's human nature. What we really are trying to focus on is how do we connect people to the river? And that has been, historically, it's been a place that we all gather around, right? So it's not unusual for our events to have people from all walks of life, from all different professions, backgrounds, and needs and wants to come together over the river. I think most people agree that a cleaner river is better for our health, it's better for our communities. In Duluth here and Superior, we have seen, I've been here to witness the change over to where the river was so polluted that you couldn't even go in it. And there's all kinds of stories about people who grew up on the river who were scolded as children for going in the river, and they just weren't allowed to go in the river, a lot of them. And so now we're seeing the cleaner water, and we're seeing the impacts of that and how it's changed our communities, and how we've gone from devastation and degradation to restoration and resilience and sort of a renaissance of things happening around the river. So really the answer is, on a primal level, we are all made to understand that we are part water and that we need the water. And so get people down to the water so they fall in love with it.
Once you have agreement that things need to get better, what type of action can take place?
Well, what's happened here is when the EPA was created and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative was passed, funds became available then. I mean, it's all about prioritization.
Right.
Funds became available to actually start doing the remediation. And we've created different means throughout the last couple of decades to help get this work done.
So what does that remediation consist of?
So it consisted of, I mean, I'll just touch on a little bit because it's been a really long process, but the St. Louis River Citizens Action Committee was the first group of where the St. Louis River Alliance came from.
Right.
Was the EPA required a citizen's input into this process of an area of concern. And there was a whole bunch of scientists and citizens and agencies that came together to talk about what needed to be done. So they created a blueprint of what needed to happen to delist this as an area of concern.
And what did that blueprint consist of?
It came to habitat restoration, and they all have to do with what the funds will provide for is habitat restoration and actual remediation of contaminated sediments. And those things were all determined by a huge group of individuals. And so the funds are available for things that were degraded by historical pollution. It doesn't address, the area of concern does not address things that are happening right this minute.
Right. So what's really important here is that when you have a contaminated area, we're talking about real dredging, we're talking about removal of materials.
Correct.
So there is poison that is lying under the surface. That actually needs to be removed first. Now, the habitat restoration, which comes subsequently, is also important because nature can restore itself if it does not have to contend with poisons.
Correct. So they've all happened, they're not happening linearly, but, and so in our organization has actually just provided the citizens' input into the process to help guide that. We also help get people to the table, and we also have some of our own habitat projects ourselves. And so our piece that we do is to try to get citizen involvement and citizens' awareness of these things. And so we do things like plant wild rice. We get people out, volunteers and members out to help plant wild rice, and we do those things through like the Wisconsin DNR, through the Minnesota DNR, through Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is actually working on remediation. And one of the biggest things that needed to happen was, like you said, was the remediation. And the remediation of the contaminated sediments. And so those spots were determined by the agencies, and there was 10 different sites that needed to be remediated that are being worked on right now, but they didn't have the funding to do it. And so the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative had a match for us to get, or for the agencies to get to do the remediation work, but they needed to get a state match for that. So the St. Louis River Alliance was asked to take the lead on getting a bonding bill passed. And that was kind of a major accomplishment for our organization. And it actually, at the time, our organization was sort of dwindling a little bit and not quite sure what we should be working on. And we didn't have a large membership at the time. And this project was a huge boon for everybody.
It helped to re-energize.
It did. It re-energized, and the community truly wants to get behind these kinds of things, and they see how important it is. And so we worked on doing a huge campaign to make people aware of what was happening, because we hired, basically we hired a lobbyist to work with the legislature, and which is, this bonding bill is, and the river money that was needed was actually very bipartisan. And so we created a giant coalition of support. Our organization led this giant coalition of support. We raised enough money to pay for the lobbyist. We had a huge support. The Governor of Dayton was included in his water quality package. It took 2 years to pass it, but during that time, we re-energized the whole community because they wanted to be a part of this. And people are very, in Duluth and Superior, are very astute, and they're very interested, and they pay attention to these things, and they want to know where their money is going. So we actually passed the bonding bill in 2017, and it was for $25.4 million, and that triggered a $47.2 million federal funds. And so this is a $73 million project that's been happening out in the river, and it's the largest part of the area of concern remedial action plan. we have a vision. We're not going to continually fight or resist other organizations do that, and there's a place for everybody to do that work. I think that my role in this organization and our board's role in this organization is to help create a vision or help people remind people of what that vision is.
And create a movement.
And create a movement which is based on what we want to see in the world.
Kris Eilers, thank you so much for explaining the work of the St. Louis River Alliance and also how important the river is to the character of Duluth and this region. It is part of the city. It is a treasured part. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for your leadership, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.